and welcome to episode 151, PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Yes, sir. How you doing, bud?
I'm doing great.
Yeah?
Absolutely no complaints right now.
Well, let's see how that holds up for the next hour or so. I wonder if part of your no complaints is because you're drinking something fun. So let's dive right into that.
Well, we're going to talk about the U.S. News Law School rankings today. And, of course, I have lots of negative things to say about those, so that'll be a lot of fun.
I've already got complaints.
But we always try to figure out some kind of drink that goes along with maybe the most popular drink or something like that. And I was actually out with my brother-in-law and a friend of his the other night, and I saw a drink on the menu that I like the look of. And I'd been kind of thinking about these drinks called flips, which are made with usually eggs or egg whites, and then they shake the heck out of them and they get frothy on the top, and they had one on the menu. And so I got that, and I'm having a vodka flip with blackberry and lemon, and the hell has been shooken out of it. So it's all frothy and it's really good. I was blown away by it. But I think flip is going to be the word of the day when it comes to rankings.
Yeah,
what are
I'm
you
watching
drinking?
some of these schools change places. That's an interesting one of alcohol and protein, which you don't often see together. There you go. So I was thinking popularity too, but I've also been planning a trip overseas next month. Now that we've got some of this stuff behind us with new courses and new websites and all the recent launches that we've been going through. And one of the places I'll be bouncing through is Prague. And so I was like, I wonder what their beer is over there. And it's a Pilsner. Pilsner, I'm sure I'm going to butcher the name. Urquell, I think, Urquell. So I was thinking about that this weekend. I picked up a 12-pack and I'm drinking a beer. A Prague beer, a Czech beer.
They sell that in the U.S. I mean, it's not widely available, but it is available. So
I had never had it before. I don't drink a lot of beer anyway. But as soon as I knew that I was going to the Czech Republic for a bit next month, I was like, let me start to get up to speed with the culture. This is me being culture.
Beer drinking culture. Is that what you're talking about?
That's right. Yeah. I'm going to drink my way to local status.
Become a local legend.
Something
in
like
your own
that.
Mind.
Yeah. I'm going to be the local they asked to leave. But that's what we've got. The song I thought was interesting too, and this was kind of clever, or at least tongue-in-cheek of you to suggest. So I'll let you elaborate on what you've picked for us.
Well, last year we used David Bowie's Changes. Obviously, he had passed away, and that's one of my favorite songs. But Changes in general is perfect for what the law school rankings are all about. They always change. They're always moving around. There's really no solidity other than the top 14, and even that moves a bit. And so kind of in an ironic nod, we decided to use the same song again. So although the song is called Changes, there's no change in the song that we've actually posted up for this one. So it's David Bowie. If you're not a David Bowie fan, and John, I don't think you really are.
No, that's fair. I'm not.
I think you should be, and go listen to his catalog. He's outrageously good and interesting, and I think a real superstar performer. So
I'll give you interesting, but I do think this is the first time we've done this in 151 episodes, the first time we've repeated a song.
Yep.
But this conversation itself feels so repetitive, feels so like deja vu in the worst way, because it's the same ideas over and over with different schools switching into different places, flipping, as you said.
Okay, so you're not talking about my comments about David Bowie. You're talking about the rankings?
No, David Bowie's already been talked about too much. He's been given more than he deserves as far as I care.
I was like, you're really going after me here. That's kind of brutal.
No. I thought it was, I don't love the song itself, but I thought it was clever that you redo one. So I'll give you that much.
Well, on that note, let's get into the LSAT world here. And really, there's two things of note, I would say, from our perspective. Number one, as always, a series of free webinars to the LSAT public are coming up. There is one that is coming up really soon, and that is on basic conditional reasoning. That is on April 24th. And there's an advanced conditional reasoning webinar on May 14th. And sandwiched inside of that is one, John, that you and I will be hosting, and that is the Crystal Mini Ball on May 1st.
That's right.
That'll be at 8 p.m. Eastern. We are going to revisit the predictions from April and June very briefly. We're going to remove all the April information that we know appeared on that test because there was a fair amount of content that did appear, and we're going to update this specifically for June 2024 LSAT takers. We will not dive into the long discussions that we have about the most likely question types in LR and logic games and all that kind of stuff. We'll basically update the problem sets and the predictions. So it'll be maybe an hour long at most there. But that is on May 1st, which if I recall correctly
next
is a Wednesday night.
That's right,
Yeah.
next Wednesday. In fact, it's a big week next week, especially for April people. And especially for April people thinking about June. There's the mini ball for June, but April scores also come out next week as well. So a lot going on. And this week, of course, related to the LSAT, we also have the makeup exams for anybody who had issues in the original April administration. So that's kind of fun. I'll be tracking that through this week as well. Have some updates.
Absolutely. Adding that to the repository of information that we have. I'm sure we'll get a slew of messages tomorrow about that.
I hope so.
And then at least for our purposes, one of the things that should be happening later on this week, fingers crossed on the PowerScore side, is that we're releasing a series of new courses that are pointed at the August 2024 LSAT and later. So removes all the analytics and logic game sections that are related to logic games and so forth, and focuses just on LR and RC, all the new test formats. We've actually changed the style in which we are delivering the content. It's no longer kind of like the big lessons, the college style courses that we used to do. It's much more of a choose your own adventure kind of on-demand environment, and then we do daily live classes. So those will launch out on this Thursday, and hopefully those will come off pretty well. It's all really a matter of just getting the technology straight and the delivery and everything like that. We've got the courses done. You and I are ready to go.
Yeah, the content's there. We just got to make sure people can access it the way we intend for them to. What's kind of cool about the content, as a slightly shameless self-plug, is this is the first time in a long time that you and I have actually sat down and taught this stuff really cover to cover for LR and RC. You did a lot of the LR, I did some, and I did most of the RC. But if anyone appreciates listening to us, this is a chance to really hear us get deep into the test instructionally, which again is something we haven't had a chance to do all that much in recent years, so this was fun.
Yeah, I think people have had a chance to, kind of see a little bit inside my mind, specifically with like logical reasoning, and then both of us with reading comprehension through the LSAT Bibles. But this is more live discussion of concepts, a little more nuance to it. And when we get to the live classes, you and I are sprinkled throughout those as well. I think on the first day, I'm teaching the second class, you're teaching the third class.
Something like that, yeah. So we
It's
will be
along those lines.
We'll be around here and there, but if you want us in bulk, the courses themselves, the on-demand pre-recorded stuff, there's plenty of us to go around. One might say too much to go around, but there we are.
One might say that, and they probably will.
Yeah, I'm sure.
All right, well, let's turn to the main event here, the big discussion, which is the 2024-2025 U.S. News Law School rankings. They kind of changed the way they've titled these a little bit. Last year, they were the 2024 rankings, even though it was 2023. This year, we're just going to call them the 24-25 rankings to just keep it less confusing. But let's start with an overview, John, of a little bit of the methodology. Sure. I don't want to go too deeply into this because this really isn't something where I want to analyze all the numbers, but it's worthwhile to understand what it is that U.S. News does, why it's so arbitrary and, in really my opinion, largely useless. But since we're going to talk about it, and it's a big deal in the law school space and the LSAT prep space, I at least want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page in terms of what it is they do and a little bit of how they do it. Does that sound good?
Yeah, it works for me. I think it'd be easy to get bogged down in the statistics and stuff here. Let's try not to.
Yeah, I'll keep it super light. I'm not going to go through every one of these categories. Essentially what happens is that U.S. News now uses a lot of public information, employment statistics, for example, bar passage rates. And last year they made serious changes to the way they weighted some of these things. And they put a lot more on outcomes such as bar passage and employment and so forth. And so one of the big areas that they use is what they call placement. That is 58% of the rankings, and it's exactly the same as it was last year in terms of the percentages. It's all about your employment at 10 months and your first-time bar passage and ultimate bar passage. 2 years ago, this section was only 26%, so they really beefed it up. And even though they kept all the percentages the same, the one change they made was they now, instead of having single-year use of these rates, they now use a 2-year average. So knowing that, I bet you $5 next year they use a 3-year average to kind of create less volatility in the rankings.
Yeah, that would make sense. Let me interject one quick point before you move on, because you referenced 2 years ago and the weight that was assigned to this, the percentile weight, which was only 26% in this placement category, which again is employment, first-time bar passage, and then ultimate bar passage. if people really want to hear the big change that happened, it wasn't from last year to this year. It was from 2 years ago to last year. That's when we started to see these numbers really shift. So if you're curious about some of the methodology changes that remain in place this year, go listen to this episode from when we did it last year. You'll hear the same song, but you'll see some very different numbers assigned to these, because last year was when they made big changes to the methodology.
Yeah, and that was episode 132.
Oh, look at you.
So placement, 58%. Outcomes, and I think that's actually, it was too low at 26%. Bumping it up to 58% is a little bit more reasonable. I honestly think that it should be higher than 58%. I think that's a little bit low. The next is what they call quality, which I think is a hilarious description of what they're doing. And they divide this into really two groups. One is peer assessment, how other law schools see you, and the other is how lawyers and judges see you. Last year, it was 25%. This year, it's 25%. It used to be 40%.
Yeah, this is the one that dropped.
Yeah, they do a survey, and some people have said, oh, that you don't know what the results of the survey are. Sure, I don't. Of course, you can see, based upon the rankings, how it is that people actually view these schools. All these law schools know that Harvard and Yale and Stanford are really good schools, and they always rate them really highly. And it's really a reputational thing. The one difference this year, even though the statistics are exactly the same, is they added in a survey of big law partners. So you can imagine that they're going to weight the really big name schools, and a lot of big law firms, they don't interview at every school. They only interview at some schools. So I would imagine that we saw a little bit more of an emphasis on the schools that are historically considered to be the top schools, the top 20, 25, than previously. So I look at that a little suspiciously. I'm like, oh, this year it's big law? Oh, wait a second. Wouldn't that maybe stabilize the very top? Because there's a lot of discussion that you and I have had about how U.S. News doesn't really want the rankings to shift radically, because that would completely undermine all prior rankings.
Yep.
In the terms of an old LSAT question, the 13th stroke of a clock invalidates the prior 12.
That's right.
And that's exactly what we'd have here. That's a huge throwback into the 80s with the LSAT.
And just an old sort of idiom or adage. Where you saw this be, I think, most impactful was when the rankings changed from 2 years ago to last year. Because, again, 2 years ago, this was 40% of the metric of the rankings. Last year, it dropped down to 25%. And there were some schools that were hurt by that adjusted weighting, Harvard being one of them, interestingly enough. When your reputation, let's call it quality, as they say, which is stupid, when that takes on less significance in the overall scheme of things and your ranking drops, it means that you are essentially bolstered by your reputation and not some of these other harder metrics. That was Harvard's case.
Yeah, I think you actually make a great point. Quality is a misnomer. Reputation would be far, far better.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's 25%. So you're already up into the 80%, 83% of what we're looking at. The last two are very broadly selectivity, which is where the actual hard numbers of median LSAT and GRE, median GPA, and then acceptance rate come in. And those are exactly the same. That all adds up to just 10%. That's down from what it was 2 years ago. It was 21%. Then last year was 10%. It stayed at 10%. So what's happened is that relatively speaking, LSAT and GPA become less influential on the rankings themselves. And then acceptance rate, which is one of the reasons schools play this game of, I'm not sure we're going to accept you yet while we wait and see how the rest of the class goes, it figures into this. And then the final 7%, which again seems a little high to me, is faculty and library resources. And that's the same as it was before. The student to faculty ratio is 5% of all the rankings. Not sure that that's 5% worthy, but that's what it is. It is more than your GPA.
Yeah.
5 to 4. I'm like, that's wrong. And then library resources, ever so important, 2%.
To be fair, at least they have dropped those down from the 13% that category was 2 years ago. So that, I think, is probably for the best. It is interesting to me. I always think that selectivity category, which includes LSAT, GPA, and acceptance rate, I always find the weighting within that category to be interesting, where they take LSAT and GPA as nearly identical in establishing these rankings, 5% LSAT, 4% GPA. And yet we know that law schools weight the LSAT much more heavily when it comes to who they choose to admit versus waitlist versus deny. So why U.S. News doesn't treat these tests and these credentials the same way that law schools themselves do, that's a head scratcher for me a little bit.
Yeah.
But most of this is a head scratcher, if I'm honest. So why start there?
And, here's the funny thing is last year we had some issues with the release of the information. There were problems with the data. And we had that same thing this year. The blog Above the Law, which reports on law schools very widely, talked about the fact that after they released a preliminary version of the rankings, which came out on April 3rd, they found out that like 80 schools were incorrectly ranked, including 9 of the schools that were in the top 50. And so then they had to restate the rankings again the next day. This happened last year. And at a certain point, when you start saying, all right, here's our new rankings, and they're full of mistakes that have to be publicly corrected. And last year we talked about this in the episode.
Yeah.
You have to start wondering whether or not the whole process is so deeply and inherently flawed that it really should be ignored entirely. I'm not a big fan of it. And that leads really to, I think, a natural conversation is how should you treat these rankings? And are they weighing the right things? John, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Well, my first thought is that you were going to say something slightly different, which is should these be ignored entirely? And that leads to a conversation. What I thought you were going to say is, are we part of the problem? Because we do keep talking about it.
That's true. We are part of the problem.
Yeah.
So I never claim not to be.
I don't think we're guiltless in this because we're publicizing these rankings as though they matter as well. We're doing this not to add a degree of significance they don't deserve. We're doing this because people talk about it and we want to set the record straight. If there's some discussion out there and we feel like we could add some clarity to it or some structure and guidance, that's where we step in and try to help. So that's what this is designed to be.
Let me also say this, is that we don't talk about it in some reverential manner.
No, quite the opposite.
The best school.
Yeah.
I'd say we largely mock these rankings. I think they're ridiculous. They're put out by a corporation that has a goal of making money and of protecting their kind of like their turf in terms of making money. So let's just be aware of what the source is.
Yeah.
They can make all the claims they want about, oh, this is altruistic and we do this for the good of the public. But when you get down into it, a lot of times what looks like a really big difference between schools isn't. It's very small. And the most important criticism I think that can be leveled at rankings, outside of the fact that ranking schools against each other is inherently tough. This isn't a football game. I don't know whether Michigan is a better school than Penn or whether Penn is the better school. For one person, Michigan might be the better school, and for another person, Penn might be it. It is so personalized that the idea of one as being institutionally better is really kind of a joke. But keep in mind that the rankings are produced by a company that sets the weighting of the values. They're the ones that decide that LSAT is 5% and GPA is 4% and that student-faculty ratio is 5% and things like that. So when we kind of like get into that, they're not an authority on anything. There's a magazine with some people that make up rankings of everything from hospitals to colleges to grad schools. I don't think we should be looking upon them thinking, wow, they did an amazing job. Honestly, I wish it would go away because it looks like it's decisive, but it's anything but. And the analogy I used last year, John, was I said, go in and take a look at the preseason NCAA basketball rankings or the preseason football rankings and then tell me how it looked at the end. Some things will be close. A lot of things won't be.
Yeah.
And some surprises will pop up in both who's in the end and who got knocked down out of the end. So take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, some upsets to be sure. I've always found it strange that somehow U.S. News has become kind of the de facto go-to or like the main pedestal holder here. And I've always wondered why that is the case, because certainly there are other, I would argue, better metrics and algorithms that could be used. Some places out there, attempt to do it. I think Above the Law even has done their rankings before. I know Spivey's played with it. We've toyed with these things as well. So it's always strange to me how one becomes kind of the preeminent focal point. In this case, this magazine, as you say. It's a little bit like, how did Michelin get to be the one giving restaurant stars? Like, how come they're the gold standard here?
Well,
and you don't have to, you probably do actually know the answer to that question. This is the first thing that came to mind is what an odd choice for the metric or the gold standard, the barometer for restaurant successes. They make tires.
You're not pushing it with me. I love this story. They were making their tires, right? The Michelin tires, the Michelin Man, etc.
Of course, yeah.
They wanted people to drive. So they started rating restaurants and putting out this guide of like all these great restaurants so people would drive to them.
I knew the guide, but that actually makes a lot more sense. Wear your tires out faster going to places out of town that we say are great.
Old tires must have wore out really quick, and so that made a lot more sense back then than it does now. But that is actually the connection. That's why Michelin, of all people, does the famous Michelin stars to restaurants.
Well, there you go. But in the way that they became kind of the preeminent source to go to, so has U.S. News, despite the fact that I actually don't think, and I'm not applying this to Michelin, but I don't think U.S. News actually has the best rating system based on the metrics we just discussed. So again, to reiterate your point, how much stock should you put in these rankings? How much should they affect your decisions? Very little.
Let me say this, because you actually bring up a point that I could see working here, which is that Michelin doesn't try to say this is the number 1 restaurant, this is the number 2, this is the number 3. That's not what they're doing. They're saying there are tiers of classification, and indeed they're based upon, certain things. Sometimes it's the individual taste of the person that's there, but like service levels, right. All that kind of stuff. If U.S. News did that with law schools, like here's our 5-star law school, and there's like 20 of them, here's our 4-star law schools and so forth, I would probably like this a heck of a lot better, because at that point, you're not saying that Harvard is better than Yale or the reverse. You're just saying, hey, they're both 5-star law schools. We all know they're good. That system would make a heck of a lot more sense, John. And maybe you and I should make our own law school rankings built around that and not put them numerically, but on a star system. I would be down for that. And having eaten at some very, very good Michelin restaurants before, there are differences. Mm-hmm. I can see the difference between a 3-star and a 2-star and a 1-star. And you don't think about it until you're there. And then you start noticing the little things in the 3-star Michelin restaurants that I've eaten at. They are 3 stars. Like you can feel the quality. But some of those restaurants are better than some of the other 3-star.
Sure.
So I have a lot of opinions about food and wine. So.
I know you do. I just literally, a month or two ago, ate at the best restaurant in the world, Central in Lima. And Peru doesn't do Michelin stars at all. So Central's the best restaurant in the world by almost every professional take, and yet they don't have any Michelin stars. So
by one take.
By more than one. I did some research.
Everybody acknowledges it's a great restaurant. I'm sure they'd have 3 Michelin stars. I'm just saying, I don't know that everybody, whatever, we're not going to get into it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's good. I knew I shouldn't have used Michelin as an example. I was like, this is a black hole. But back to this. I do think, A, that it's interesting U.S. News has become kind of the default to go to with these rankings, because I don't think they do the best job. B, I do think they're given an over sense of importance, rankings in general. So take all of this that we're about to say with a bit of a grain of salt. And certainly as you make the decisions that you're ultimately going to make as to where to go to school and trying to rank things yourself, don't just default to the numbers here themselves. You can use the statistics within these rankings. I think those are helpful. I'm glad they make them public. But I wouldn't place too much stock in, this is a number 6 school, this is a number 9, that must make a big difference. It doesn't.
Well, on that note, let's take a look at some of the big changes that we've seen among the top 14, the top 25, and the top 50. And then after that, we'll do my favorite segment of this discussion, which is the winners and losers.
Heck yeah, it's my favorite too.
Who really rose, and then who got clobbered. So one of the things we'll start off with is the T14, which is a really odd kind of designation. Why is that? And it refers to the schools that have really been in the same top 14 schools since they started this. It's now really kind of a top 15 because UCLA keeps creeping in at the edge.
Yeah.
It always kind of, Georgetown was right at the very bottom at 14, the bottom of it. They're still quite high. And then UCLA keeps jumping in and kind of going back. So let's take a look at the movement that we just saw within the T14 this year. And I'll start off by saying Stanford and Yale continue to be tied for the first position.
Yep.
Chicago holds at number 3, so it didn't change. And then you've got a really interesting thing going on at the 4th spot. You've got a 4-way tie. Mm-hmm. And UVA, of all schools, has jumped up 4 spots from 8 to 4. Duke and Harvard moved up a spot, each of them. And I always like to see Duke in any conversation of the best. So they all jumped into a tie with Penn for number 4. So those 4 schools, UVA, Duke, Harvard, and Penn, are number 4. So then that means that's 4, 5, 6, and 7. Mm-hmm. Columbia, of all schools, is number 8. So I would think, people historically would say, well, Columbia was always top 6, usually, 4 or 5, right in that zone. They are now number 8. And one of the early losers is NYU, which dropped down 2 spots into a tie for 9th with both Northwestern and Michigan, who each climbed a spot. So you got New York and then 2 Midwest schools, Northwestern and Michigan, all at number 9. Berkeley dropped down 2 spots to number 12. UCLA climbs up from 14 into 13. And then Cornell and Georgetown are tied at 14th. Cornell dropped 1. Georgetown came back up from being number 15. So they're both tied for number 14. So we have the same schools we always do in the T14. And I would say, John, in response to that, sure, this wasn't manipulated at all. Nothing was done there at all.
Yeah, it's the same 15 really being just shuffled around a little bit. The top 3 didn't move. UVA was the big winner of that group, jumping from, I think, 8th to 4th. And interestingly enough, Columbia and NYU have sort of switched spots in this. NYU, I think, was 7th last year. And Columbia, by holding steady at number 8, is now ahead of NYU, who dropped to 9th. And of course, at the 13th, 14th, 15th position, you've got about 4 schools that just constantly swap around: UCLA, Cornell, Georgetown, Northwestern, all just sort of circling that cutoff point.
Yeah, Duke used to be down there a little bit, and they've been on a steady rise.
Yeah, up to 4th, which is, I mean, Duke and Harvard are now considered equivalent by these rankings. It's impressive.
Yeah, now, if I really wish this was a basketball ranking, and then we could put Duke at number 1, but that's a whole other conversation. Let's go to the T25, and you start to see bigger movement, more volatility that floats around here. Kind of the biggest move in the early part is that Washington University in St. Louis, last year they dropped 4 down to number 20. This year they go back up 4. So they dropped down, now they've returned, they're back to number 16. Notre Dame jumped 7 spots to number 20. USC, Southern Cal, dropped 4 to number 20, and that reversed their rise. So you talk about flips. Washington University in St. Louis dropped last year. Now they flip back up. Here's USC, had risen 4. Now they're back down 4. Ohio State dropped 4 spots to number 26, and last year they jumped up 8 to get to 22. So now they go back down halfway. And then both BYU and Florida dropped 6 spots to 28. And Florida had been on a long rise up, so here they've taken a little bit of reversal. I'll kind of mention that again a little bit later. But this is what you start to see once you get outside the top 14 is the movements become bigger. Yeah. And they continue on. There's some schools in here that have moved quite a bit eventually.
This is probably my favorite category when it comes to like the ranking partitions, because to me, not only do you see some big moves here, but this is perfectly demonstrative of just how, in many ways, arbitrary this is. I mean, take for instance, USC or Washington St. Louis. That Washington drops 4 spots last year, is back up 4 this year. Has the school in 3 years really changed that much? To gain 4, to lose 4, to drop? I mean,
from 1 year,
over 1 year to the next, has it changed enough to move 4 different positions in these rankings? And again, these are highly ranked schools. This is the best of the best, still top 25.
They put a new coat of paint on the law school, I think. That was good for 4 spots, right?
They hired 1 teacher and the student ratio went crazy.
I'm joking.
No, of course we are joking.
Seriously, sometimes I feel that that's the way these movements are. It's like we added 10 extra books to the library.
Right.
Look at us.
Right. We changed our library hours. We're open an extra hour on Tuesday night. So that gains me 2
chairs.
New chairs.
New chairs in one of the classrooms.
New upholstery. But that's how this feels. It is kind of that like capricious and inscrutable. USC is another good example. The opposite really of St. Louis, Washington St. Louis, where they're down 4 this year, but they had gained 4 last year. Have they really changed that much? 8 spots over 2 years of movement? No. So again, back to the idea of like, be careful how much weight you actually put into this, how much stock you give for this.
Absolutely. So let's expand it out to the T50 and look at some of the notable moves there. I've only listed out the moves that were 7 spots or more. There were plenty of moves that were like 4 or 5 and so forth. So Washington Lee, which kind of dropped down for a while, up 7 to number 33. They've always been a really well thought of law school, and then in the rankings, they didn't show very well for a while. They're starting to move back up in this system. Illinois jumped up 7 to 36. They dropped 8 last year, so now they've reversed that fortune. William and Mary, another well thought of law school, up 9 spots to number 36. That offsets their drop of 15 last year. You're like, it's like a yo-yo in there. And it's not that William and Mary suddenly got worse and then better. It's the same school fundamentally. This is an example of how little numbers can make it look like there's a big change. This is why I don't like numerical rankings when it comes to something like education. Emory, a school you and I are both familiar with in Atlanta, down 7 to 42. Last year they dropped 5, so that's 2-year drop now of 12.
They've had a rough go of it there, Emory. They've gone from 30 to 42 in 2 years. And again, is the school just falling apart? Is that what's happened here to cause this? Of course not.
Has that Coke money run out? Because, Coca-Cola has contributed a ton to them.
Coca-Cola.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about a South America connection.
I was going to say they should be ranked higher. But, okay.
Yeah, there was nothing untoward about that. They didn't have some kind of surreptitious connection. This was the Coca-Cola Corporation. And then UC Irvine down 7 to 42. And then suddenly Florida State jumps up 8 to 48. And so kind of big moves. And this is why I often discount the rankings when they're numerical like this, is they just have such volatility. I don't think any school is 9 spots better or 10 spots worse or what have you here.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, that rounds out the top 15. We could probably keep on doing this over and over, but we'll bring that in at the very end with the winners and losers. And on that note, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
This will we'll hit all areas of the rankings from the very top to the ones that move the most, both up and down. So there were a lot to pick from. I've narrowed it down a little bit. There's actually more winners than losers this year, so there'll be a little back-to-back winner episode in the middle. But I'm going to start with a pair of winners, in my opinion, and those schools are UVA and Duke, some ACC compatriots here. UVA, as you mentioned before, was the big winner in the T14, moving up 4 spots and now into a tie with Harvard, Duke, and Penn. But, I feel like Duke, after rising 6 spots last year, they didn't suffer a reversal of fortune. They're able to be in that same conversation. And when you're in the top 5 like that, you're getting a lot of recognition. And so I feel like those 2 schools are the ones that probably come out as the early winners from like that T6 kind of breakdown, T8, I suppose, given the tie at 4th.
Yeah. But there's a maybe small little asterisk or footnote on that. If we had to call a loser from that group, I still feel if Harvard's paying any attention to this, that they've got to be a little frustrated, because not only have they slipped to 4th and stayed there for another year, but now there's even more schools joining them. And I imagine if you ask the typical Harvard law grad, do you feel like you're equivalent school to say UVA and Duke? They'd scoff at that. But according to this, they are.
You know what they'd say? Of course not. We're much better than UVA. We're not even in Duke's league.
Right. Well, have I got a magazine for you?
Is it the Duke Alumni Magazine on my desk right now?
Oh, God.
Yes, I am totally biased, but I'm happy to admit it and have fun with it.
Sure.
I'm actually a big fan of Harvard. I think it's a great school. This is no knock on them. We're just really having fun with the rankings. But when you look at Harvard last year, they moved out of the top 3 I think last year for the first time ever.
First time I'm aware of, yeah.
Or maybe that was 2 years ago, and then they dropped another spot last year into 5th. It's just ridiculous. I don't think anyone who, when they're thinking, what are the best schools, the best law schools in the country, thinks to themselves, yeah, Harvard's 5th, or in a tie for 4th with 3 other schools. It's just not the way it's been for years.
Yeah, if you're counting off schools on your fingers, nobody thinks Harvard needs a second hand. But according to this, they might. Which is funny to me.
There you go. All right, Sean, I'll let you hit a loser here. Who's the loser we've got coming up now?
Well, NYU, I think, certainly felt some problems this year. They have dropped to number 9. They're usually 6. Sometimes I've seen them at 5th. Sometimes I've seen them at 7. But this, again, is where we saw a slip in the top 14 or so. I believe they dropped 2 spots from last year. And again, Columbia sitting at number 8 was sort of sandwiched between New York over years past, NYU.
Yeah, you're exactly right. They usually are 6th. They've wobbled a little bit up or down 1, but this is the lowest ranking for them in years. So I would imagine they're a little bit frustrated because they're like, this is not the way the world views us, but this is the way U.S. News is viewing them right now and putting them a little pressure. Let's go into some winners, and that would be Georgetown and UCLA. At the bottom of the T14, which is a great place to be, and a lot of schools would love to be there. UCLA moves up another 1 to 13. Georgetown climbs 1 into the kind of like a tie for 14th. Last year they'd slipped to 15, and UCLA and Georgetown have been kind of flip-flopping that 14-15 spot. Now they both end up in it, and because you have a tie for 14th, they can have all 15 schools in there.
Yeah.
So I would imagine Georgetown was like, all right, good, we're back in the 14. I don't think they like seeing UCLA being ranked ahead of them, even though it's a meaningless ranking. And in Westwood, they're celebrating.
For sure. I mean, I think they're celebrating in Westwood regardless, my experience. But for sure, this is one more reason to party. I wonder if
fun
at some
nights in
point,
Westwood.
Yeah, me too, buddy. Me too. I've had some fun nights in Westwood with you, actually.
That's true also.
Mm-hmm. But I wonder if at some point this T14 is going to evolve slightly to become a T15, because there is this just cohort of 15 schools that are always right there. And that 14th position, it feels like it's kind of fair game for about 3 or 4 schools every year. You might as well just call it the top 15 and keep all these guys in the group.
You want to hit the next loser?
Yeah, you give me the losers here, which I think is definitely a more fun thing. Thank you. Appreciate it. In this case, we stay on the East Coast. So it was NYU up in the Northeast. Now we drop down to the bottom in Florida. And it is, in fact, Florida. They'd been crushing it for years. I think they had gone from number 51 a few years back all the way up to number 21. And last year they were 22. So, I mean, that is a meteoric rise, jumping almost 30 points, at least up to last year, or 30 spots. But they took a hit this year. So after all of these successful years, they actually dropped 6 spots from 22 last year to number 28 this year. They're still in the top 30, which is where I think some lines are often drawn by people, 25 or 30. Yeah. But they've got to be curious as to what happened, because they've been doing everything right for a long time. Where did things go wrong to slip 6 spots?
Well, I think their dean moved on to a new position heading up a college in New York, and who knows if that's kind of tied to this, the way they allocate resources and so forth. I don't know the answer to that, but sometimes I think administrator changes do actually lead to changes in actual ranking because of the way they prioritize things. So either way, you're right. They'd gone from 51 to 21 over the course of a number of years, which is really hard to do. And it gets harder when the closer you get to the top, the harder it is to move more, especially with these entrenched schools that have a lot of resources. And Florida had been able to do that. And I've said this on prior podcasts that schools like Florida and Texas A&M, I've seen put resources into trying to make a better educational experience for their students. And they've seen payoffs on that. So here you see a little bit of a drop. We'll have to keep our eye on that going forward, because next year, does that continue? Do they reverse that? Do they, stay the same? We'll have to see. And that takes us to the next set of winners. 2 schools that I would almost consider homeland schools.
I was about to say, this pair is perfect.
Yeah, I'm originally from Minnesota, so that's one of the schools. You're originally from Georgia, and I've lived there. That's another school there. And both of these schools showed big jumps last year. And then this year, the winning, formula was they held those positions. Minnesota last year jumped 5 spots to number 16. We saw a lot of reversals of fortune. Not for them. They have stayed at number 16. So they're now solidly inside the top 20. My whole family went there for the most part as undergrads and so forth. So I'm really familiar with that school. I've been on the campus many, many times. Been in Dinkytown partying. Don't tell anyone. It was good times. And then Georgia jumped 9 spots last year to number 20, and they held it. And of course, Athens is a fabulous town as well. And you know a lot more about Athens than I do, and I know a little bit about it.
Yeah, I've forgotten more about Athens than most people will ever know. So,
sure.
It's I was a second home to me in college. I dated a girl there while I was in Atlanta for a couple years. But I will say this a little closer to now. A good friend of mine who was a tutoring student of mine a couple of years back is just now in her 3rd year at Georgia. And I remember last year she was so excited about the prestige of being number 20. I'm sure she's feeling equally excited this year to stay there. So congratulations to the Bulldogs.
Yes, successes on the football field and now the law school field as well.
That's right. And the importance is in that order.
Probably, because one of them's got a lot more publicity.
Yeah. All right, you want to do another loser closer to home? Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say I was talking with some Duke alumni this weekend, actually, at a party I was at, and we were talking about the effect of how the basketball program, when it really became, utterly dominant for a while, it really changed the dimensionality of how people saw the school, just because so many more people knew the name And certainly schools like Georgia usually see a bump after they have really big sports success because people are like, I would like to go to that school. Here you go.
Yeah.
You want to do the loser here?
Yeah, I don't mind doing this loser because it's right down the road from me. This is Pepperdine, which anytime Pepperdine gets a bad rap, I always feel like if you saw the campus, you would forgive them for whatever their ranking is. I mean, I know you know the campus as well.
Oh, I do.
It's one of the most picturesque campuses, maybe the most beautiful campus of a law school that I'm aware of. So, yeah, regardless of the fact that they have now slipped 7 spots from 45th to 52, so they're out of the top 50, for whatever that means, I still have great affection for Pepperdine in general. It's a wonderful place.
Let's just say that when it comes to the actual view from the campus, it's probably unbeatable.
Yeah.
You know, there's some campuses that are beautiful and have beautiful features around them, and that's a different conversation. You climb up the side of the hill in Malibu, and you get this sweeping view of the Pacific Ocean, the coastline, the PCH there. Yeah, it's pretty sweet.
Yeah, so sorry to Pepperdine, but congratulations to Pepperdine students, because just look out the window. You got it pretty good.
You're looking good. Unfortunately, out of the top 50 for now, but, you know, kind of like the salve to the wound is you could easily be back in the top 50 next year. And that leads us to the next pair of winners, which was Florida State and Colorado, which again, a lot of ink spilled this past year on their football teams. Both of them jumped 8 spots to number 48. So as Pepperdine exited the top 50, these two schools, at least for now, have entered the top 50.
Yeah. The Deion Sanders effect. There you go.
Maybe so. Maybe
Prime
he's recruiting
time.
law students as well.
God, let's hope not.
You never know.
So, yeah, winners, losers. Let's keep the winner streak alive here. As you said at the outset of this, I think there's more winners than losers on the whole. Here's another one, a winner. Penn State, which you can elaborate on some of this. There's 2 schools associated with Penn State. One's University Park, one's Dickinson. Both of them jump double digits. University Park is up 12 from number 80 all the way to 68. So I think anytime, too, you jump from, I tend to think of this in tens. You were a school in the 80s, now you're a school in the 60s. You were on the fringes of both of those, 80 to 68. But that is a significant difference. It's the difference in a score in the 160s and the 170s, even if it's a 169 to a 171. Categorically, It sounds significant. And then Penn State Dickinson is up even more. They're up 14, but to number 75. So they were 89 previously.
Yeah, and both of those schools had big drops last year. The Dickinson drop was 31.
Oof.
So to come back 14 probably makes them feel a little bit better, assuages the wounds, as it were. And I think that school is one that I've seen put some resources into both those law schools. And so they'd had a rise, and then last year was really an anomaly for them. They'd had a big drop at 31 spots. It gives you a great example of like, wait, this school dropped 31 places last year? That's ridiculous. Now they're back up 14. Wouldn't surprise me to see another jump next year to kind of get back to where they were previously. So they have to be happy.
Yeah.
And that really brings us, John, I think to the final 2 loser and winner pairing. And this time I'll take the losers.
Okay.
These are the biggest losers. So not like the TV show, but here in law school, all these schools dropped by over 20 spots. And I'll start with the biggest drop of all, which was Louisville dropping 37 spots from 99 to 136. That was the greatest level of movement of any school in the entire rankings hierarchy. A school not too far from me, the University of California, San Francisco, they dropped 22 spots from 60 to 82, which is a fair bit when you just look at the numerical aspect of it. And then Gonzaga dropped 21 spots down to 120. So interestingly enough, both the schools that had previously been 99, Louisville and Gonzaga, had precipitous drops. Louisville's, though, 37, pretty rough, and again, making me question the validity of the rankings. If they dropped 37 spots in 1 year, what was U.S. News thinking last year? Why did they rate them so highly? I mean, we act like a 37-spot drop should just be like, oh, that's fine, that's the way it is. No, it isn't.
Yeah, 2 years ago to last year, I could see some justification for these kinds of swings because the metrics changed so much. But the metrics, the algorithm and formula they use for this hasn't changed at all. since last year to now, and schools can still move 37 spots. There's something fundamentally wrong with how this works. It feels a lot like just guesswork. It feels made up, frankly. By the way, was The Biggest Loser? Is that reality show about weight loss?
Yeah.
Okay. I was trying to figure out where I knew that from. God, people just watch anything. Notice what's happening here, though, because, we're talking about schools that have moved over 20 spots. This is what you get in the higher rankings. The biggest move in the top 15 was UVA, a whopping 4 positions. Now we're talking about schools that have moved 37 positions. So the higher up you get in the rankings, the more volatility and the greater the swings. Why that happens to be the case, I think, again, is partly because it's just been kind of codified and permanent. What happens near the top, there's more latitude to move things around with schools that people pay less attention to.
And also, this is probably just a couple metrics didn't come quite in as well as they had before. And all of a sudden, cumulatively, it's bad news. All right. So we talked about The Biggest Losers, and we now know you won't be watching that TV show. I don't even know if it's still on. How about The Biggest Winners?
Yeah, this is a good one to end on a positive note, because in the same way that you saw 3 schools and just mentioned them that had dropped over 20 spots, there were also 3 schools that had significantly gained over 20 spots. And I'll go through the list really quickly. Catholic is up 28 positions to number 94. That's a big jump. They won 22 or something before, I think. Samford, not Stanford, Samford is up also 28 to number 103. So they're creeping down into the double digits rankings, which will be nice to see them get to. And then Maine is up 26 points to number 120. So there you go. The 3 biggest moves on the map were those 3 schools, Catholic, Samford, and Maine, all 25 to 30 points apiece.
Very different schools, too. So I've actually spent a lot of time on the Catholic campus back when I lived in D.C. ages ago, seeing a girl there. And I always liked that school. So, and in being in D.C. is a great thing, but they're probably the biggest winner there out of them all, because not only they go up 28, but they moved into the top 100. So kind of a big win for them. But really, that's the recap, and we treat it both seriously and as a joke. As we've said before, we kind of report what has happened, but at the same time, as we talk about it, we kind of try to point out that, look, if you're sitting there making a decision and you're looking at 2 schools, don't think to yourself, this is the better ranked school, I've got to go here, because it could change. And also, it's meaningless. Go to the school that you think is the school that you will like the most, that you can thrive at and do the best at, because grades are what's going to matter coming out of law school. Maybe that school is slightly less highly ranked than another school, but if you're going to feel way more comfortable, that's a big win. And then, of course, money factors into all of this. Maybe you can have the choice of like a really highly ranked school versus a lesser ranked school, but the lesser ranked school is free to you, or as free as it's going to get. That is often the better deal when it comes down to all these things. That's a whole other conversation. We did a podcast on that about prestige versus scholarship and how to make some of those choices. That is an episode that's like, it's in the first 10 episodes we did.
It was early.
Yeah, it was very early, but it's a conversation that I always reference, comes back year after year. There's a blog about it that I often answer questions on, and there's literally hundreds of comments and going back. So a lot of times people think rankings are ironclad. Maybe this discussion has proven they're nothing at all like ironclad. They move constantly. Schools rise and fall. I've seen people say, I don't know if I should go to this school. They just dropped 10 spots this year, and they go there and they go up 15 the next year, and they're like all excited. I'm like, but doesn't that just prove that next year they might drop 5 or 10? You don't know. Don't worry about that. Focus on the schools that have the best employment placements, the best financial deal for you, and the ones where you think you're going to do the best, because when it comes down to it, your performance is what really matters.
Buddy, I usually have something to add at the end of these, but I don't think I can improve on what you just said, so I'm going to let that stand as the mutual farewell.
Well, I guess I'll agree and say that you could not improve upon it.
Nope.
If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions, We're often doing mailbag episodes. Certainly one is coming soon. Send those questions to LSAT podcast@powerscore.com. You can ask us about law school, the LSAT, you name it. In the meantime, hopefully this has been helpful. If you get a chance, come join us on May 1st for the Crystal Mini Ball for the June LSAT, and keep an eye out for those new courses that we talked about earlier. In the meantime, stay safe out there, and we will talk to you soon.